The Tulsa Race Massacre, America's hidden Black Wall Street. In the early 20th century, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, emerged as one of the most prosperous and self-sufficient African American communities in the United States. Often referred to as Black Wall Street, Greenwood became a symbol of Black excellence, resilience, and entrepreneurship during a time when the rest of the country was dominated by Jim Crow laws, racial segregation, and economic oppression. This thriving district boasted hundreds of Black-owned businesses, cultural institutions, and a remarkable degree of economic independence. Yet in 1921, this beacon of Black achievement was violently destroyed in a coordinated, state-sanctioned act of white supremacist terror, now known as the Tulsa Race Massacre. For decades, the truth about the Tulsa Race Massacre was deliberately hidden, omitted from textbooks, and ignored in mainstream American discourse. It was not merely an episode of racial violence, but a calculated attempt to erase a flourishing Black community from the American landscape. To understand the full scope of what happened and why it matters today, we must examine the origins of Greenwood, the socio-political context of early 20th century America, the massacre itself. The origins of Greenwood, Black aspirations in a new frontier. The Greenwood district was born out of the vision of early Black settlers who migrated to Oklahoma in search of opportunity. Following the Civil War, many African Americans left the South during the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction eras, seeking freedom and the possibility of land ownership in the West. Some came as formerly enslaved individuals. Others were descendants of freedmen who had aligned with Native American tribes or moved into Indian territory. One of the key figures in Greenwood's founding was O.W. Gurley, a successful African-American entrepreneur, who purchased 40 acres of land in Tulsa and made it available exclusively to Black settlers. He and other pioneers established businesses, homes, churches, and schools, creating a vibrant, self-contained community that quickly became a haven for African Americans, escaping the brutal realities of racial violence and economic exclusion elsewhere in the country. By the early 1910s, Greenwood was thriving. It featured over 300 Black-owned businesses, including grocery stores, barbershops, banks, hotels, cafes, movie theaters, and professional offices. The district had its own school system, hospitals, and public transportation infrastructure. Residents of Greenwood lived in well-appointed homes, and many were well-educated, socially engaged, and politically active. The community's wealth and self-sufficiency earned it national attention and the nickname Black Wall Street. The paradox of segregation. Ironically, segregation played a role in Greenwood's economic success. Because Black residents were barred from shopping or receiving services in white-owned establishments, they spent their money within their own community. Dollars circulated multiple times before leaving Greenwood, creating an ecosystem of mutual economic support. In this sense, systemic racism inadvertently strengthened Greenwood's local economy. However, this economic vitality also bred resentment among many white Tulsans, who viewed Black prosperity as a threat to the established racial order. White laborers feared competition, and white elites resented the cultural pride and political ambition emanating from Greenwood. These simmering tensions were inflamed by national developments, including the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, post-World War I racial paranoia, and frequent lynchings across the South and Midwest. Tulsa, like many cities, was a powder keg waiting to ignite, the incident that ignited the massacre. On May 30th, 1921, a Black teenager named Dick Rowland entered an elevator in the Drexel Building in downtown Tulsa. The elevator operator was a young white woman named Sarah Page. Accounts of what transpired vary, but a scream was heard, and Rowland fled. Page did not press charges, but Rowland was arrested and taken to jail. Local newspapers sensationalized the incident with headlines like, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator," stoking public outrage and calls for lynching. On the evening of May 31st, a white mob gathered outside the courthouse where Rowland was held. In response, a group of about 75 armed Black men, many of them World War I veterans, arrived to protect Rowland and prevent another lynching. Tensions escalated, a shot was fired, chaos erupted. The white mob, now several thousand strong, turned its fury on Greenwood. The massacre unfolds. Over a 24-hour period from May 31st to June 1st, 1921, the Greenwood district was attacked with ruthless efficiency. White mobs looted homes and businesses, set buildings ablaze, and indiscriminately shot residents. Churches, schools, hospitals, and libraries were destroyed. Over 35 city blocks were razed. According to eyewitnesses, airplanes flew overhead, dropping firebombs on buildings and shooting at fleeing families. Estimates of the death toll range widely. Official records listed around 36 deaths, but modern historians believe the true number lies between 100 and 300. More than 1,200 homes were destroyed, and over 10,000 black residents were left homeless. Many survivors were rounded up and held in detention centers by the National Guard. Others fled Tulsa permanently, never to return. Entire families were torn apart. Children were killed or separated from their parents. Elderly residents who couldn't flee were burned alive in their homes. Pregnant women ran through the streets under gunfire. People hid in cellars, churches, and under floorboards for hours, listening to their neighbors scream. In a bitter twist, Rowland was quietly released after Page recanted her accusation. No one from the white mob was ever prosecuted. Most insurance claims filed by black residents were denied under riot clauses. Greenwood was not only physically destroyed, but legally and economically disenfranchised. The long silence. After the massacre, city and state officials worked swiftly to suppress the truth. Newspapers stopped reporting on it. School curricula omitted it. Survivors were silenced by trauma and fear. For decades, the massacre was erased from public memory. Why it was erased? The Tulsa Race Massacre was not forgotten by accident. It was erased deliberately, through silence, intimidation, policy, and selective education. First, no one was held accountable. Officials, police, and citizens who participated in or allowed the violence faced no legal consequences. There was no incentive for the government to acknowledge wrongdoing. Second, insurance companies refused to pay claims, invoking riot clauses. This left victims without compensation and further erased the financial legacy of Greenwood. Acknowledging the massacre would have opened the door to restitution, so it was buried. Third, textbooks were sanitized. In an effort to maintain the narrative of American progress and unity, school curricula avoided subjects like Tulsa. Entire generations grew up never hearing about it, not in history class, not in the media, and not in public dialogue. Fourth, survivors lived in fear and trauma. Many were silenced by threats or shamed into silence. Others chose never to speak of it again, leaving their children and grandchildren unaware of the horrors they had endured. Finally, it challenged the myth of a just and fair society. Greenwood proved that even black success, even black excellence, was not safe from white supremacy. That truth was too uncomfortable for a nation unwilling to confront its own racial violence. Cultural awakening and calls for justice. In the 21st century, a renewed focus on racial justice has brought the Tulsa Race Massacre into the national consciousness. Documentaries, books, museum exhibits, and dramatic portrayals such as HBO's Watchmen and Lovecraft Country have educated millions. The 100th anniversary in 2021 was marked by widespread media coverage, artistic tributes, and a presidential visit. President Joe Biden, in a historic speech delivered in Tulsa, acknowledged the massacre as an act of domestic terrorism. He met with surviving victims, then over 100 years old, and called for truth and repair. Still, no formal reparations have been granted. Survivors and descendants continue to seek restitution through lawsuits and advocacy, arguing that justice delayed is justice denied. Mass graves and the ongoing search for truth. In recent years, historians and archaeologists have located possible mass grave sites in Tulsa, long suspected by survivors and their families. These graves, hidden in plain sight beneath parks and public land, are believed to contain the remains of many victims. The search for these graves and the slow pace of excavation reflect ongoing resistance to full transparency and accountability. The role of women and children. Among those killed and displaced were countless women and children. Their stories have often been left out of the historical narrative. Entire families vanished. Mothers died, shielding their babies. Children ran barefoot through fire and rubble. Eyewitnesses described the anguish of women dragged from their homes and assaulted, the horror of babies suffocating in smoke-filled basements. These women were not passive victims. They were business owners, teachers, community leaders, and survivors. After the massacre, it was often the women who took in orphans, rebuilt homes from ashes, and re-established Greenwood's schools and churches. Economic devastation and stolen wealth. The massacre destroyed not just property, but generational wealth. Some historians estimate the financial loss in today's dollars to be over $200 million. Homes, land deeds, inventories, personal savings, all gone in a single day. Black families who had worked for decades to build financial security were left with nothing. Insurance policies were denied. Banks refused loans to rebuild. White developers later profited off the land. Rebuilding began almost immediately, despite every obstacle. Black residents used what little they had left to construct makeshift homes, re-establish businesses, and open schools. Their resilience was extraordinary, but they were never made whole. Resistance and survival. Survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre never gave up. They told their stories in private, passed down oral histories, wrote letters, and kept clippings hidden. Their children and grandchildren became activists, lawyers, and educators. The fight for recognition took generations. People like Olivia Hooker, a survivor who later became one of the first black women to serve in the U.S. Coast Guard, spent her life advocating for justice. Others, like Viola Fletcher, testified before Congress at 107 years old, saying, "I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire." Legacy of Greenwood. Today, the legacy of Greenwood lives on, through descendants, historians, and community organizers who refuse to let the story be forgotten. The Greenwood Cultural Center, the John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Park, and the Greenwood Rising History Center serve as anchors for education and remembrance. Yet Tulsa's black community continues to face challenges: economic disparity, gentrification, and systemic barriers that echo the inequities of the past. The trauma of 1921 lingers not only in memory, but in material conditions. Understanding Greenwood's destruction is essential not merely for historical accuracy, but for addressing ongoing racial injustice. Conclusion: truth as a path to justice. The Tulsa Race Massacre was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of racial violence and suppression that plagued the United States throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. What made Tulsa distinct was the scale of the violence and the success of the community that was targeted. Black Wall Street wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a vision of what Black America could be. Remembering Tulsa is an act of resistance against historical amnesia. It is a demand for accountability. It is a call to honor those who perished and those who survived. And it is a commitment to building a nation where such atrocities can never happen again. Only through full recognition, reparative action, and sustained justice can we begin to heal from the wounds of Greenwood. Justice is not only about punishment, it is about restoration. And the road to restoration begins with remembering.